But as you know, because you live it every single day, we talk about it every single night, the reality of Albo-nomics. This is where the federal budget position seems to get better by the day, but the reality of the people who pay the taxes in this country gets worse by the hour. Now, as you know, most of the people who talk about politics for a living, they live inside the bubble of the yes-voting ACT. There are also people who are in no danger of seeing their jobs disappear anytime soon, and most likely they can whinge their way to the local union or their boss to get a pay rise. But the reality for most Australians is that they don't get much out of the system, but their job is to shut up and pay for it. Again, the way that our politicians talk about our economy is in this sort of hands-off way. When the Prime Minister and the Treasurer go thumbing through the budget papers, they give themselves a pat on the back for this or a pat on the back for that. But the reality is that all they truly care about is being able to say surplus equals good, deficit equals bad. And while, as a rule, that's a good thing because you don't want a whole string of surpluses because every year's deficit gets added to the last, to the last, to the last, and you end up with $1 trillion worth of debt. The reality is that the self-congratulations that the politicians give themselves for how well the economy is doing is a complete other world to the one that you are living in. Now, the reality is, while the budget may be in surplus, you are going backwards. Why? Cost of living. It was the number one issue going into the May 2022 election. It has been so every week since. But of course, all of the things that were the reason to change the government in May of 2022 are now amplified by November 2023, including the value of the Australian dollar. The value of the Australian dollar is now down by a substantial amount of money. Before the current Prime Minister was there, it was about 74 US cents, and now it's about 64 US cents. So a full 10-cent reduction means that everything that we import into the country costs more. It also means that everything we export from the country, we're able to make more profit from, and of course, because the taxes get connected to all of that, the budget deficit seems to disappear. So get the point here that the overall, overarching, everything is awesome, except for the individual. Now, inflation in this country has been out of control for a long time. Now, we can all freely admit that as you look from the left to the right, that the bad times of the 80s and 90s have only been rivalled with the most recent spikes in inflation. And while inflation is ever so slightly down on where it was, it's still back to where the bad times were in the 1980s and 90s. As we tell you on this program every night, because we're able to find the data to prove what you already know, it's too much. And it's going up again in the past 2 months, which means today was inevitable. It was inevitable today that the Reserve Bank would meet and the Reserve Bank would increase interest rates because inflation was starting to head back up in the wrong direction.
Reserve Bank Governor Michelle Bullock today delivered her first interest rate rise.
The RBA today hiked official rates by 1/4%.
It's the news households and businesses across the country had been expecting but dreading all the same. A 13th interest rate rise.
The day started in celebrations. But it quickly turned sour. The bets came in. Rate hike 13 was inevitable.
Now, you notice here that the media is all very clever in talking about rate hike 13 because they're trying to pretend that it's all the same thing. But, of course, we know that there was, after the first rate hike, a change in government, meaning that it has only ever gone up or stayed level, never gone down, on the watch of the two people who pat themselves on the back because the budget's looking good and they feel your pain. But now that we have the Albo-dozen of interest rate rises, it's now important to have a look at the difference since this bloke became Prime Minister. The reality, if you are paying off a house, is that you know you are paying more. But have a look at how much people are paying when it comes to more. The average home loan in Australia is somewhere between $500,000 and $700,000. So overall, you are paying more than $1,100 a month or $1,800 a month or $2,500 a month if it's a $1 million loan. But think about it this way. If I had told you that in May of 2022, when people were making their decisions about who you wanted to be in charge of the economy, would you have voted for the people who lead to you having to pay an extra $13,500 a year on your mortgage? Or the people who have sat back and let inflation get out of control, do nothing about cost of living, so you're paying an extra almost $22,000 a year. That's on top of what you're already paying. And for the people in the major cities, it's almost $30,000. That's the reality. That the Albo-dozen has done the damage, has broken the back of Australians. How is anyone supposed to find $30,000, $13,000 or $21,000? Now, of course, we all cut back, but then we find new ways to cut back, and for some families, they're starting to cut into the bone. Mark my words, people are going to have to sell their house. And while that may well be fantastic for the nearly 1.5 million migrants that will end up here because there'll be a new place to go, people will be pushed into a rental market that currently can't serve any more people. Remember, there was a place that was up for grabs in Ipswich recently. It wasn't a flash joint. It was a normal place for rent in Ipswich. But for every place that is currently for rent in Ipswich, more than 120 people turn up to have a look at it. Let alone the queues around the bend in southeast Queensland, Sydney, Melbourne and much of the regions as well. Now, there is a person who is in charge of the Australian economy who wants all of the props when he delivers a budget surplus, but accepts none of the responsibility when you suffer as a result of the way they are managing our economy. He's the man who said this when it was just one interest rate rise.
This is a full-blown cost of living crisis on Scott Morrison's watch. When things are going well in the economy, he takes all of the credit. And when times are tough in the economy, he takes none of the responsibility.
And surprise, surprise, the man who criticised a former government for taking all the credit but none of the blame is doing exactly the same after a dozen interest rate rises since he took over the economy.
They take these decisions independently. They can explain those decisions, and I refer you to the statement for the explanation of what's happened today.
You see, he thought that it was all the previous Reserve Bank governor's fault. So that's why they spun and blamed, but spent and offered very little to change people's lives when it came to cost of living. So they got what they wanted. They didn't reappoint him. They used his deputy and assumed that she would do the right thing and not create a political problem for the government and not raise interest rates. But then inflation went up for the past 2 months, which meant that interest rate rises had to take place. Amazingly, there are just as many articles in the smart press tonight about the relationship, or lack thereof, between the Reserve Bank and the government as opposed to the people who get screwed over, like those that are now having to spend, and I repeat again, $13,500 extra on your mortgage every year, $21,000 or $29,000. And again, there is one thing that I have spoken about many, many times that this government could do to offer a little bit of relief. Now, they say that they are spending the best part of $26 billion, and that has reduced inflation by 0.5%. Well, the reality is that we're now at about 5.5%. So, okay. But there's something that is a major driver of inflation that would cost far less than $26 billion a year to do something about. It would create zero inflationary pressure. Instead, it would provide relief. And you know I'm going to talk about petrol. Because petrol, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, went from about $1.20 in September of 2020, and now we're sitting anywhere between $2 and $2.10. You notice the spikes? When we start to change the government, it goes up and up and up and continues to do so. In fact, in the past month alone, the inflation that you are paying on petrol is 19.7%. The previous month, it was about 15%. Petrol is included in what's called the basket of goods, the thing that they look at to decide how Australia is going when it comes to inflation. Power prices are also in there, as are tobacco. Now, amazingly, the federal government has decided to increase taxes, therefore how much you have to pay for tobacco, and we'll slowly see that become part of the inflation issue. Power prices continue to go through the roof, not because of the war in Ukraine, but because we're spending literally T4 trillions of dollars transitioning from one electricity system to another, and throw on top of that petrol, where the government rakes out about $6 billion a year in taxes from petrol. Now, tomorrow they could reduce that taxation by 25 cents per litre for 6 months. It would cost $3 billion. That's it. If they wanted to make it 50 cents for 6 months, obviously $6 billion. If they wanted to keep 25 cents off your petrol from tomorrow for 12 months, again, $6 billion. And they wouldn't have to go deeper into deficit. They wouldn't have to borrow a cent. You see, this government has got a $20 billion surplus, which means they are deliberately choosing not to reduce this tax that could tomorrow help save your family budget, help save a small business, help save distribution chains as everything is moved around the country. Now, Jim Chalmers actually said today that he can read the numbers just like we can, and that petrol is part of the inflation problem.
The primary driver of inflation in the most recent data was petrol.
The other bit that he misses, of course, is, as I said, power prices, which is more than 18%. So it's petrol first, power prices second, and they are the two big drivers. But, of course, green energy, we can't criticise that. Now, today, an opinion poll came out. Other hosts have made reference to it and got on them for doing so. But what about this part of the detail from Newspoll? 81% of Australians say they want the fuel tax cut. They know what we say on this show is true, and hopefully the message is spreading by you spreading this on social media. But when asked about it today, would he use part of his $20 billion surplus to cut your petrol, to push down inflation, to save Australian families? What do you reckon the answer was?
We're not currently working up any proposals on the fuel excise. We are focused on rolling out $23 billion of cost of living help.
The bloke who gets driven around in a limousine, who has the position to choose how much you pay for petrol, is simply saying to you, let them eat cake, because I don't want to sacrifice how I look politically when it comes to a budget surplus. And of course, nobody, when they ever get near him, asks questions about cutting the taxes, but I think that call's going to get louder. Mark my words, we've been right the whole way along. Now, there's a very personal story that I want to tell you here that's not one that's going to be full of rack and ruin. It's not going to curdle your blood, and it's not going to make you feel like this is the poorest person in Australia. But I want to introduce you to a bloke who is well and truly being affected like many suburban people are when it comes to inflation. You see, we've already shown you that Albo-nomics is currently seeing the government banking $20 billion in surplus, but people are lined up around the block for food. We've shown you that people all over the country are struggling with power prices to the extent where people are not taking showers, not turning on air conditioners. These are the people who are being deeply affected by government policy decisions, but because the people who are in charge of what you get to read and see and what we talk about and what the political conversation is, well, of course, these people mostly vote Green or live in a teal seat, live in the ACT, and they're unaffected. They can take all this in their stride. But there are plenty of people like Jules, who are exactly who I think of when we frame this program every day and when we talk about this issue every night. Jules is a 45-year-old bloke who spoke to the Financial Review today, and he is a removalist. He says that, put simply, life is work, sleep, repeat. Being a small business person, the only way he gets a pay rise is to get up earlier, go to bed later and work an extra day if he has a day off at all. I want you to hear his circumstances. Jules Evans doesn't have much time for anything other than working and looking after his kids. The 45-year-old removalist and father of 3 has to work more than 60 hours a week. Remember, public servants wouldn't even work 40. Politicians even less, to meet his mortgage repayments, which have risen from $2,700 to $3,500 per month since the Reserve Bank started lifting the interest rates. And then there's the fuel costs for his business, the orthodontics bills for his kids. It's pretty much work, sleep, work, sleep, work, sleep, work, sleep, work, sleep. His business, by the way, free plug, is Truck of the Irish. He also has no emergency savings and almost no room to further cut his spending should his repayments keep rising, which of course they have today. He said he's already down to 100% outfits from Kmart and is a regular user of vouchers and discount apps to bring down other costs. He quit smoking years ago, he quit drinking years ago, he doesn't have any extra personal costs. I'm just a money-making and kid-carrying machine at the moment. Now, blokes like him are average Australia. People who are not the beneficiaries of an endless world of welfare handouts. 35% of the federal budget is spent on welfare handouts. Yet the Treasurer, who has an extra $20 billion, is saying that he will not cut fuel by 25 cents a litre. That would help this bloke's life. It would help his business. It would help his kids. But no interest. Instead, the Prime Minister and his useless Treasurer just say cost of living, and somehow that's meant to be comfort for a bloke who literally is doing back-breaking work to pay for a roof for his kids.
Addressing that cost of living challenge, which is our #1 priority.
Help with the cost of living is our #1 priority.
The highest priority of the Albanese Labor government is rolling out this cost of living relief.
We continue to have as our #1 priority cost of living relief.
Seriously, ring your local MP. Ring your local MP and demand they cut your petrol taxes by 25 cents a litre. And every time you drive past one, look at that and say, thanks, Albo. Thanks, Grim Jim, because that's the reality of the economy that we're living right now.